Art Talk Rewind, a podcast series by Luxembourg Art Week. This series revisits the art talk that took place at the fair, where partners and guests explored key questions shaping contemporary artistic creation and the art market. Generative AI and the attribution of credit in artistic creation. Cultur, Art Council Luxembourg and University of Luxembourg.
And the epistemological and ethical questions raised by using AI in historical and creative practices. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. In recent years, the proliferation and widespread uptake of generative AI systems has placed pressure on foundational concepts we use to understand the central human pursuits of discovering, learning, and creating. For example, when scientists rely on an AI system to discover a new drug, pressure is placed on our understanding of what it means to be a scientific discoverer. And when, say, ChatGPT is used to compose a text, our ideas of what it means to be an author also become blurry. So where does language editing end and the loss of human authorship begin? In the case of creative visual production, generative AI systems have caused similar and especially controversial uncertainties. When Gen AI systems that have been trained on vast data sets of other people's artistic work can so rapidly produce competent images from human prompts, a number of questions are raised about creativity, intellectual property, and credit attribution. Two sets of questions stand out in particular. First of all, regarding creativity and art. So, can Gen AI facilitate creativity? Is an output art? Should users be considered artists? And second, regarding creatorship. What does it mean to be a creator or author in the age of AI? And who made or created a Gen AI output? In our work, we have tried to resolve and overcome some of these difficulties. We focus specifically on creatorship, so the second set of questions that you see up here. Whether outputs are considered art, that's a separate debate, and instead we look solely at the question of who made it, like who made these outputs. Looking at generative visual AI systems that allow a user to generate images from text, image, and other input prompts, such as Stable Diffusion and ChatGPT, we address the key questions of, do human users create through their prompting, with generative AI being just a tool at their disposal? And what role do Gen AI systems actually play in creative production? And we also turn to think about the role of the developers and training data producers upon whose work these systems rely. Do they also deserve credit for the outputs too? So we were interested in these questions on an intellectual and an ethical level. This is because they speak to some very important epistemological issues. They also speak to important moral problems because obviously the misattribution of credit is unjust. But our interest was also very much motivated by the widespread practical, ethical, legal, and regulatory uncertainty that these disruptions have yielded, especially in the public realm. So how society decides to answer these questions have very real economic and social consequences for those involved, affecting how we come to value works and who benefits from those works. These uncertainties have featured heavily in public and legal discourse about generative AI, with debates underway over, for example, whether outputs are copyrightable, if scraping data for training models constitutes fair use, where the line between inspiration and theft falls, whether AI systems can create art themselves autonomously, and who should take responsibility for any harmful or infringing outputs that are made using Gen AI systems. So in this talk, we'll be introducing a framework we have developed to help address these issues and make progress on better understanding creatorship in the age of generative AI. Our framework helps significantly advance over existing views in the public debate, which can be roughly organised into three groups. So first of all, we have the first group. So in this group, people tend to argue that the humans prompting the Gen AI systems, they should be considered the creators, and the Gen AI is just a tool. So in their view, the Gen AI system lacks agency, it lacks autonomy, it lacks understanding, and it therefore doesn't show any genuine creativity. It only follows the predetermined programming that it was trained to do. So in this view, Gen AI is framed more like a tool. So it's, like a new version of a paintbrush, or it's like a very advanced form of Photoshop. And as you probably all be familiar with, that is also how a lot of the producers of these sorts of tools tend to frame these systems. They are framed as a tool, and they're trained as something that you can take control of as the user. But then at the second group, they lie at the sort of polar opposite of this first opinion. And in that view, generative AI does create itself, and actually the human user is taking the back seat. So in this view, in some cases, they think that the Gen AI can somewhat autonomously create novel imagery, exhibiting relevant analogues of things like skill, imagination, and creativity that, we socially deem very important to being a creator. But then in between these two views, we have the collaborative perspective. And here, it's more nuanced. We have humans and machines co-creating together. And these collaborative views, they resonate a lot with the pre-existing art theory views regarding co-production. So we find this collaborative view more compelling, and that is the view that we have also taken. But what we noted about this collaborative view is that it really doesn't give you much information on about how the credit can be distributed. So we know it's collaborative, but to what degree? Is there someone who deserves more credit for their output or less? So to fill this gap, that is what our framework has aimed to do. We try to provide a rich conceptual machinery that helps us think through and work out how we can go about distributing that credit for these outputs. So I'll now hand over to Donal, who will explain this framework to you in greater detail.
Thanks, Finn. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this framework, how it works, and also illustrate a little bit what it can do for us. So our work starts from the idea that centrally asking this question, who is the creator of a Gen AI output, is misleading from the get-go, right? So it was built on the wrong conceptual foundations. Why is that? I should introduce that framework, which is called collective-centered creation. And it'll be self-explanatory in a second. This framework insists that for most cases of creation with Gen AI, there is no clear single creator to be credited with the output. Instead, there is a collective of agents and entities, including Gen AI systems themselves, who all made important contributions of different kinds that we need to think through what role they played and how they interacted. And third, what follows on the heels of this is that credit should be distributed according to the nature and significance of these contributions. Okay, now here are 4 key questions that we want to endeavor to answer with our framework. First, well, who are the creators then? Who belongs to the collective? How much credit are they due? For what kind of contribution? And what features of contributors and their contributions should we look to make those kinds of judgments? Okay, so in what follows, I'll expand on 3 features out of 7 overall in the paper that we'll link to later, just to give you a rundown of roughly how the dynamics of this framework works. Okay. So the first feature that we focus on is what we call relevance or non-redundancy. The idea is that take X, which is a contributor or their contribution, away, what would the output have looked like, right? Counterfactually. If I hadn't been there, would this talk have gone down, or would have had just stopped after Finn gave the introduction? Okay, so imagine a painter, a traditional painter called Joe. And when she paints, she tries to involve her friends. One of her friends is Jake, whose role is to hand her the brushes exactly as she requests them, right? Her other friend, Jerome, often comes around to make suggestions for composition. Now, between the two, it seems that Jake is much more replaceable. He's more redundant. And if Jake is not around, well, Jo can just get the brushes herself, right? Whereas replacing Jerome is more difficult, right? If she were to replace Jerome with yet another friend, right, then they would make maybe different suggestions, implying differences for the output that Joe would end up with. Okay, so between the two, Jake is less relevant, more redundant. And then the more relevant and non-redundant, the stronger your claim to be part of a co-creating collective, right? That's the idea. The second feature is called control. What does that mean? It responds to the question, how precisely and robustly did X which can be an agent, steer or maintain an output Y to be a certain way rather than a bunch of other potential ways. I'll expand on this in a second to make the idea more vivid. So let's assume we have Jaina, who uses GenAI to make sort of these types of cat images that you see on the right, and she iteratively refines her prompts until she gets exactly the output that you see on the right. That's where her process terminates. Now compare this with a casual user called Jake, who just prompts sort of like, cat on a mat, and he's sort of happy with pretty much any output that he gets that sort of loosely fits that description, right? So between the two, it seems that Jaina exerts more control over the output because she iterates on her prompt and has a sort of a definitive vision of what she wants in her head, whereas Jake is sort of happy with pretty much whatever he gets. And so the more control you exert, the stronger the claim to be a co-creator. Now, I also want to sort of stress that control is really just about causing things to be a certain way, not intending them to be a certain way. In fact, it would be the GenAI system that exerts control in a way that stops Jake from getting what he wants. So between the two, actually the GenAI system has more control over the output than the user. All right, finally, third, originality. This responds to the question sort of how original a contribution is and how unique it is to a contributor. So where do we look for originality? Well, a natural starting point is to think about user prompts, okay? So imagine a really creative user who comes up with this, let us assume, never before envisioned prompt of a Donald Trump-shaped cheese wheel rolling down a hill. So there's never been an image like that in the history of humanity. Nobody's ever come up with this idea before. This is what our user does. Versus a prompt that just says, cute dog. Not especially original, probably redundant. Millions of people have already sort of, thought, oh yeah, image of a cute dog would be nice to have. So one is more original than the other. We also want to sort of point out that we think that GenAI systems themselves can also sometimes exhibit originality in this sense. How so? Well, at training, they learn novel, often statistical relationships between, for instance, text and image or pixel data. And at inference, when actually synthesizing images, they draw on these, never before discovered relationships. That sort of certain words tend to correspond with certain kinds of visual representations and so on. Now, if you build a machine that can make an image of a Donald Trump-shaped cheese wheel that rolls down a hill, it's not enough for the machine to just collage these three things, like, a little Donald Trump over here, a little cheese wheel over there, and some grass down here. That's not going to, cut it. There needs to be some kind of competent form of interpolation, and that is akin to a sort of skill that the machine has acquired at training, and that needs to be sort of suitably acknowledged, we think. A sort of common objection that we get at this point is to say that, okay, all this magic of machine learning is fine, but doesn't the originality, if there ever is any, still come from the user? After all, it was their idea, right? That genius that came up with the Donald Trump-shaped cheese wheel prompt, right? And here we insist that, yeah, that's fair, right? But we also need to distinguish originality of the what, sort of what image to make, and the how to make that image, right? And these are two different tasks. So the user supplies maybe the idea of the what, but the machine sort of executes the idea of the how. So as a motivating example, imagine a user, Jake, who has this, let us suppose, really original idea of trying to visualize this abstract feeling that you get when you feel that you didn't tell someone that you love them enough. Now, Jake might use Stable Diffusion or some other text-to-image model to visualize that feeling, and he might be surprised at the result, thinking that, oh my God, this exactly captures how that feeling feels to me visually. That is fantastic, but he was unable to imagine that before the fact. So here we have an original contribution on his part and an original contribution on the part of the GenAI system. Okay, so the conclusion is then that output originality doesn't just boil down to Jake's sort of achievement in coming up with this idea. Let me say a few words on how these three features, sort of relevance, non-redundancy, control, and originality, work together to ground creatorship claims. So all of these common degrees, they're gradual. You can have more or less of any of these, right? And more usually makes for stronger claims to be a co-creator. Second, none of them are necessary, and none of them are sufficient all by themselves. So it is fine if you don't exhibit some of them at all. You can still be a co-creator. Equally, if you exhibit some of them only, that will probably never be enough to get you into the creator zone just by itself. And then more generally, sort of scoring highly across these different dimensions often will mean that you're a strong candidate to be included in a co-creating collective. So different combinations can each license strong claims. You know, there could be combinations that focus more on contributions in ideation, sort of coming up with the what, and also contributions that focus more on execution, coming up with ways of, you know, how to do things. I should also say that we don't think that these are the only features or the right ones. You know, we can have a little debate around that later on. We're very interested in your thoughts. But we do think that they're useful starting points to sort of analyze and negotiate these creatorship issues. Let me make things a little bit more vivid after sort of, you know, going through this sort of fairly abstract theoretical machinery with you, and explain a bit what this framework can actually do for us in practice. So here's a case. So Jake, who you're already familiar with, prompt stable diffusion with this incredibly imaginative prompt, cute cat. And now we have, you know, the core question: is Jake a creator of this image or not? And our framework allows us to make this question more precise, because now we can ask things like, well, did Jake exercise enough control to be a creator of that image? And the worry is that, well, perhaps not. So diffusion-based synthesis models, they often start from random noise. That's the kind of thing that, you know, you can trigger with a different seed number. Jake might have gotten an entirely different image for the same prompt, you know, if he had just started prompting a few seconds later with a different seed, right? So any of the other images that you see up there, you know, he might have equally gotten as results of his prompting exercise. And that suggests that he exercised very little control. It was kind of a bit of a lottery, really, what image he would end up with. And that implies that he actually has a weak creatorship claim, right? He didn't do well enough, maybe on one of these crucial dimensions. Okay, now let's compare this with Jaina. So she has a really clear idea of what she wants. She makes a sketch on paper with pencil that she scans and uploads and uses as a guidance prompt. And she iterates on her prompt, fancy cat in red garments. This is a bit closer. And then finally, she gets where she wants. Now, Jaina exerts more control than Jake, and therefore has a stronger claim to creatorship. Now, this framework then allows us to generate new insights. For instance, that there are what we call illusions of creatorship. People like Jake might think that they are creators wrongly because they underappreciate the sort of, you know, amount of randomness that is involved in getting them to the outputs that they claim creatorship over. That is a mistake. Jake's role seems more like that of a person browsing a gallery and picking something that they like, and that's a fine role, right? We don't fault Jake for doing that, but it's not the role of a creator. So what our framework does then is it helps promote more just allocations of credit, say between Jaina and Jake, and promotes users understanding their agency and power in staking creatorship claims that they actually deserve on the grounds, for instance, of the control that they exert. Here's another way in which this framework can do things for us. It can refine existing intuitions that we find mirrored in a lot of the public discourse and controversy around Gen AI. For instance, that Gen AI constitutes some kind of form of theft. So let's look at Jaina again. But now let's assume that Jaina is actually a traditional digital artist who doesn't work with Gen AI at all. She does her work in Painter and Photoshop and other software like that, sort of manually. And she uploads her works to various forums. They get scraped, put into a large data set, and then models like Stable Diffusion are trained on them. Now, here's a user called Jason who doesn't know about Jaina's work at all and casually prompts Stable Diffusion with the prompt fancy cat in red garments. And now this controversial question is, well, is Jason the creator of that image? Did Jaina's work maybe get stolen in some kind of important way? And again, our framework helps make progress on these questions. So users are rarely sole creators. Images are co-created. That is the core message of our work. And that also implies that training data producers like Jaina can actually be co-creators of images that users later on create and have corresponding claims. How is that the case? Well, remember these two concepts of relevance and control. To make a difference to an output and to make it a certain way rather than another way. These are two core ingredients of what we think makes a creator a creator. Now, Jaina exerts control over images in her style. Her images make a difference to Jake's output. How so? Well, we can imagine that if we took her works out of the training data set and retrained a model, then maybe, if indeed Jaina's work and her style are so distinctive and she's really the only person producing, cat images in that style, then maybe Jason's output would have looked like this, this sort of more toyish rendition. Equally, if Jaina's palette had been warmer and lighter, then maybe, again, Jason's outputs would have also been warmer and lighter correspondingly. So you can see that there is a connection between Jaina's works and Jason's outputs. And for those reasons, we might think of Jaina as an upstream co-creator, and this position might warrant certain kinds of rights to credit or compensation, or to making Jason desist from producing works in her style without her approval. Compare this with Jürgen, for instance, whose 37 pictures of his cute cat, Mr. Snuggles, were scraped from Flickr and also used to train Gen AI. Well, Jürgen is not a co-creator of cat images, and why is that? Because his cat is very generic looking. It just appears in some photographs. It's a black cat, whatever, looks like a million others. Take them out of the training data set, retrain the model. All the cat images are going to look the same. So Jürgen doesn't play the same significant causal role that Jaina plays. Again, our framework promotes more just allocations of credit, sort of giving some credit to Jaina as an upstream co-creator, and improves our understanding people's agency and their power. Okay, let me briefly wrap up. Our CCC framework, collective-centered creation, helps us rethink key concepts like creator or adjacent concepts like author to better capture and organize our relationships with generative AI in creative pursuits of various kinds. Centrally, our framework insists that creatorship is always collective, and our framework can explain how and why some users have strong creatorship claims and others don't, sort of, driving a wedge exactly in those places where a lot of the controversy has been going around. And it can explain how artists whose works are scraped for training can be considered co-creators of downstream outputs under some conditions. All of this surely must be very exciting, but you maybe also have some questions about what's next, because it's still very academic and very sort of, high level. So how can we sort of, touch sort of the ground? So things that we are thinking about right now for next steps in research is, well, how can we actually measure creatorship in practice, right? Could we, for instance, collect user logs that describe a user's interaction with a Gen AI system to make sort of more tangible exactly how much control a user exhibited, in their history of making a certain image? Similarly, there are these really general and broad questions about, well, in light of all of this, how can and should we revise, all kinds of norms around creation? So norms around disclosure of AI use, copyright norms, credit norms, compensation norms, and so on. And this is obviously work that needs to be based also on stakeholder insights and needs to bring sort of policymakers and regulators to the table as well. So this is something that we're also very excited to work more on. So yeah, there's lots more work to do, and we're very excited also for your inputs later on. I'll stop here with just hopefully the last slide where you can see some QR codes if you're interested in reading our papers. And I'll thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Finola. Thanks, Donal, for laying it out in such a concise way. Due to time constraints, I suggest we move right on to the next presentation. So, Caroline Sinders is an award-winning machine learning designer, researcher, and artist who looks at technology and the way it impacts society. The feminist data sets call for applied gender equity, questioning the ethics of tech platforms and systems today. They're the co-founder and executive director of the interdisciplinary think tank Convocation Research and Design. And for over the past decade, they've been examining the intersections of human rights, AI, intersectional justice, harmful design, and systems in technology and digital platforms. They've worked with an impressive array of collaborators, such as the Tate Modern, the United Nations, the UK's Information Commission's Officer, the European Commission, Ars Electronica Festival, the Harvard Kennedy School, and others. Caroline is currently based between London, UK, and New Orleans, USA. So, yeah, we're really looking forward to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. But yeah, hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and I work at the intersections of civil society and art, and I look at how technology disproportionately impacts marginalized groups. I always think it's important to sort of outline that my background is in photojournalism, research, and art. So I see everything through the lens of legibility and research storytelling. These are skills I honed as a photojournalist. And so with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research. Again, focusing through the lens of how design and technology impact people in their everyday lives. And this is my current workflow. This is how I approach problem solving across everything I do. I want to make research, and that includes data, analysis, et cetera, because I find it to be practical. We could go into the necessary decolonization perhaps research has to go through. But for now, let's just talk about research as a foundational element. Often what it can do is help document something that was maybe not documented before, or get a hypothesis down to explore and test. That for me creates a practical foundation. The next step for me, though, is activism or advocacy, because it's helpful and it builds on that research. It helps push society forward. It can take something that has come up out of research and often out of community-driven organizing, which is what my research will often document. I work directly with communities who are impacted by technology. We don't need to necessarily test the interventions we're requesting. We know what they can be through an analysis called threat modeling, by outlining the potential threats of what we're asking for and thinking about how that would then in turn re-impact that particular group. But this is what activism can do. It can say, this is what the change is, this is how this change could manifest, this is what the community then needs and why. But then for me, the last step is art, because I take that activism and research and distill it into something else. Art allows for further knowledge transfer and new opportunities of understanding and engagement for communities. Art can visualize and make real future provocations that pull from present urgencies. Or rather, art can make visible the invisible. It can do something that the written word alone cannot necessarily do. And by written word, I mean often our policy papers. So for me then, in this context, research, design, and art are all the same space because they're sort of feeding into the same practice. So art for me can be many things. That can be my human rights research. It can be the manifestation of an academic paper I'm writing. But it could also be tool building workshops, video installations, UX design as provocations. And so my practice is interrogating politics, ethics, and human rights implications of tech and art, often grounded in data. And again, artwork becomes this way for me to poke, break, remake, and hack pre-existing systems, or provide opportunities for us to make our own. So I do a variety of different art interventions around AI. One of them mentioned earlier is Feminist Data Set. That's a practice of mine where I create a series of workshops, and then with participants, we are creating a data set of feminist works. So in a way, you could think of it as an archive. This will eventually manifest potentially as a chatbot or a series of generative texts. I have a whole essay on it. I recommend you read it. And I want to take a moment to just really quickly highlight, let's say, the differences of different types of AI art, as not all AI art is generative AI. I would call my art practice AI-enabled art, in which I create a data set. In this case, I was working with another AI artist, Anna Riddler. We did this during COVID. Anna wasn't able to travel, so I traveled to Louisiana, where I'm from, and photographed different freshwater swamps. These are natural barriers to hurricanes, and they're made up of cypress trees that are currently threatened, often due to man-made intervention for dredging, for canals to let in oil rigs, etc. They're slowly disappearing. But again, this is a very important thing to the Gulf Coast community across the United States. Our freshwater swamps are necessary barriers for hurricanes. And so I took these images, we made our own model, we made a GAN, and that's trained, again, from these images. It's a small data set, it's 4,000 images. When this was installed, this was the same week as Hurricane Ida, which devastated the Gulf Coast communities, and inadvertently, I had photographed all of the pathway of Ida without realizing it because I had gone down the Mississippi River. So some of these trees actually don't exist anymore, and in a way, this becomes now, let's say, an emotional data set, one that's reflective of climate change that impacts the community where I'm from. This is our GAN. We made this for Feral File Online. We raised $11,000 for communities that were impacted and displaced by Ida. So we donated everything we made from this sale. So in this project for us, it's not just the GAN and the data sets, all of these different types of ephemera. Again, we're thinking about sort of this space of data. And in a way, there's a lot of intentionality in this project. But if we go back to the GAN, let's say just for like a second, what I find interesting is I can see in my head the photographs I took that make up the GAN. I can see where they come from, the Provence, let's say the flavor, if we think of this something akin to kombucha. I don't necessarily know why which images will be more emphasized than the others, but I can see the photographs I've taken. And this is true in Anna's own work with mosaic virus and mosaic tulips, which I definitely recommend y'all check out. But I'm not necessarily anti-generative AI work. I have done some on that, and I'll try to wrap up as quickly as I can. What you see here is a piece called The Rig 01, a mixed media piece exploring a futuristic world, voiced by me, in which I've overtaken an abandoned oil rig and reclaimed it as my home. This is one where climate change has accelerated, impacting Louisiana, where I'm from. This film is made up of all these different, very real abandoned oil rigs I found. This is about 15 minutes from Plaquemines Parish, a fishing community in Louisiana. It's actually slowly leaking into the swamp. It's leaking methane. At the very end of the film, I use Runway's generative AI sort of style transfer within this because I wanted to replicate shot for shot the beginning shot, but I wanted to show nature overtaking it. It was something that it just did not look right in the 3D models that we were working on. So I used my own video within that. And I do have some mixed feelings about that. But for me, this was something that I felt was necessary and poetic and very intentional to the project to show, well, what happens to these, let's say, large-scale leviathans when they're left to rust. Even photographing or even visiting one of these rigs, which I'm not supposed to do, you're not allowed to do that. We found a lot of raccoons living on there, for example, so nature has already overtaken it. And just really quickly before we open it up to conversation, I'm in a collective with Eric Salvaggio and Steph Maj Swanson. It's called ARG, or the Algorithmic Resistance Research Group. We all have different views on AI, but we're united in an interest in connecting critique and analysis of systems related to AI. What you see here is an image created by Eric, but it's from a generative AI system. It's a result of weeks of work exploring Gaussian noise diffusion loops. Eric started prompting a system for images of Gaussian noise. What happens if it's removing noise in the direction of more noise? This is what generative AI does. It's creating pixels by trying to different elements of noise. Well, what happens when you ask for no noise and then to keep creating noise? So these odd shapes appear reminiscent of building blocks of latent space between images. The prompt tells the system what image it should try to make and find inside an image of pure Gaussian noise. It does this by removing noise from an image of noise. And I think this is a great example of what we're trying to do. We red team, which is a cybersecurity term meant to hack or break a system to look for vulnerabilities. But we approach this in a data-esque and esoteric way because we're asking for esoteric things of these generative AI systems. Or in a way, we're trying to create impossible images from the mistakes we make. By hacking and breaking these generative AI systems, it leads to a deeper understanding of these systems and what they do. And this is our goal. Is it art? It's hard to say. We think of it as art and research. And I'll quote from Eric as to why. Quote, ARG is a research group because it's working on answering those questions rather than saying we offer any clear answer. We're experiment testing and challenging and pushing things in different directions. Often frame our work as research, not as art per se, to avoid the question of what is art, because that is not the most relevant question for us. The relevant question is, what does it mean to make things on our own terms? And in this, we end up with work that I think helps complicate and redefine what an image should be. I know that this kind of work is difficult ethically to parse. I deal with that, even if I'm breaking these systems to understand them better, because companies are embedding LLMs and generative AI systems into everyday consumer products. But so from a human rights standpoint, now I'm speaking, we need to understand the logic systems underpinning these systems. So even if I'm a part of breaking them, I'm still using them as an artist of purposely breaking them. And this draws on a long history of glitch art. And then we show this again through the images we make. Because these systems are trained from content that wasn't given consent. So the conflict will always be there, and that doesn't absolve us. But I think it's important within this to understand, document, and critique. And so for me, this is how it becomes a form of an artistic practice. And this image, even while synthetic, visualizes the breaking. How we made it can't be separated from what it is, which is a glitch, an error, and a representation of how image generators misunderstand. Some questions that I would like us to think on, and that were sort of prompted in response to engaging with Finola and Donal's work, which I really enjoyed. Who made this and who is responsible for it? How do tools define what it is we make as artists and designers. And in the age of Gen AI, how important is the tooling in regards to making ownership and sustainability? What does it mean to make right now? And what is the role of control and authorship in artistic creation and design? And I'd like to add also, what is the role of intention? And what does that mean as a creator? Can we distill works down to control, originality, time, effort, and leadership? And then how can those themes be subverted to redefine generative AI? So thank you.
So thanks, Caroline, for this presentation of your work. I think, I'll let you just react like Ashu to what Caroline just raised.
So I'm going to maybe jump on the opportunity to comment on the GAN, right? Because I think, make a really important point stressing that, well, we need to distinguish more finely between, Gen AI, sort of, generated art and like AI-enabled art. I really like that, concept. And like, I think on our framework, this would be sort of maybe one of the more ultimate forms of control that an artist or a creator can take over a co-production process where machines are involved in some role, probably more relegated to the role of a tool, because you built the tool yourself, right? So there's not much more sort of control, than that. I mean, it's a certain kind of control. It's maybe not sort of, discriminative in the sense of like, pushing particular pixels to be a certain way rather than another. But sort of globally, you built this tool to exhibit certain kinds of characteristics that you deemed are important. And that was your plan, and you made that plan become real. So in those kinds of cases, I think that really sort of, you would score clearly extremely highly as a creator, and there's no question around whether Gen AI played any more substantive role than that of a tool that you also happen to make yourself.
Totally. And I would say in response that, like, I do really read y'all's framework as much more one that should be perhaps only applied to generative AI, if that makes sense, and that there would be a second collaborative framework to make for non-generative AI systems around art making, because I think that's maybe where intention would come in instead of control, right? But there is, like, obviously elements of control. But this is where I often like to turn to Anna's work or what we did with the GAN. The GAN is moving actually based on data points. It was moving based on weather data from Hurricane Ida, right? So then that's like a highly intentional element. It's not just animated to animate, right? And then in turn, as you would say, that's probably a form of control, right? Like that we set very particular data points for that animation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just to follow on, I completely agree, obviously, with both of these points. But yeah, because I was really struck by the kind of the just vast difference we have here with your GAN and the Gen AI models that we're thinking of. These very, very, very large, very popular, very off-the-shelf models, and they're just trained, on literally billions of data. So compared to your 4,000 images that you made yourself. And also, I think this point that you made in our discussions earlier this week really, really spoke to me too, that I think really add an element here is just also your personal investment, not through just the technology, but the physicality of your involvement with the creation of those 4,000 images that your GAN was then trained on. Again, to go to the control, I think we can also, especially, when we're looking at people practicing like you, like artists with all of this intention and so on, it goes much beyond just the technology and the design of it and then the use of it. It's also everything that surrounds that, as you were describing. Like maybe you want to explain a little bit, but I found that a really interesting insight.
Oh, yeah, sure. So with those images, right, I have to drive from New Orleans around almost 2 or 3 hours to a very remote part of Louisiana. And then I have to get in a boat and travel another 15 or 20 minutes, like to these places. So like the physicality of visiting there is very important. And then how those images then are constructed are also very particular because they're photographed with the idea in mind of a data set. And that's different than how I would photograph for, let's say, like I won't say a piece of pure photography, but imagine I'm creating a series of images as a photographic show. So what I am showing you with all of those images in a way is my contact sheet, which I would never normally show if I were creating a highly, let's say, curated and selected portfolio of cypress trees. It would not be about quantity, it'd be about quality, right? But when you're photographing for machine learning to create something from a model, you need a high amount of images. So in this case, there are some images in the data set that are blurry, and I had a lot of very mixed feelings about including them. They're only like slightly blurry, but they would be images that I would not select to print print large because I don't think they're as compelling as some of the other images. But one thing I will say is there's a lot of interesting generative AI tools that artists do use that are not traditional, let's say, generative AI, the way that we think of like DALL-E or Midjourney, where artists are feeding it their images and they are then controlling, in a way, the outputs, right? I think that then also is, in a way, probably maybe like applicable exactly to the framework you're talking about.
So thanks, Caroline. And maybe if I could add to the notion of intention that you raised before, returning to a discussion we had ahead of the talk this week, and the historic layers of generative AI that I think Finola mentioned during our discussion. I think it's helpful to view questions surrounding copyright, authorship through the lens of media history, while still recognizing the specific technical and cultural aspects of generative AI, which you do in your paper. So traditionally, the use of technology to automate creation have been met with resistance, which we have seen with photography, for instance, digital recordings, the internet, or even the printing press. So to my understanding, over the past decades, the very notion of authorship has been in flux. We've seen it with the death of the author proclaimed by French philosopher Roland Barthes, and later with intermediality, which situates the meaning of work intersection between different media, so text, images, sound, and as well as across the entire value chain of creation, so from creators and publishers to nowadays the developers of tech platforms. So in that sense, I think your hypothesis of a collective, distributed authorship makes sense and is quite timely. I would maybe reframe with the time that we're left with, reframe this line of questioning in terms of agency. So what, according to you, and maybe Caroline will respond to that too, are the politics of collective creatorship? How do we account for the shifting distribution of agency when the builders of tech not only shape the terms of public discourse, but also have unprecedented access to our most intimate data?
Yeah, great question. Really interesting. I think my answer probably speaks to also what you were saying, these really interesting points about, the death of the author, like how this has been in flux for a long time. Because, what I was thinking there is one thing that's been coming up a lot in what I've been reading and through conversations and so on recently is I think Gen AI has taken this flux to a new point, and people are now pushing back against this idea of the death of the author, and we kind of want to know the author again. And same with art, we want it to be clear who is creating something. So, a lot of very well-known fiction, non-fiction writers are now turning to Substack, for example, and very purposely just like churning out very free text, because it sort of just is this very show of like, this is so human, this is organic, there is no way that I've relied on Gen AI, for example, to create this text. So I think that's a really interesting cultural shift that we're seeing of like, there's this desire now to bring the human back into creation. In terms of our framework, I think it is also nice in that it gives people sort of points and the conceptual machinery to articulate their agency, their control, how their work is, non-redundant to either their output or other people's outputs. Yeah, and just sort of, I guess, to bring it back to also to practicing artists, this desire to show the whole process. So the fact that your images that you created, these 4,000 images, we can also see them. And that's just such a stark contrast to these really large tech, big tech models where, obviously that's all closed off. It's not in their interest to make it available to us to see the training data. So it's a very different approach.
So maybe to put that in the context of Caroline's work, I was quite struck with the notion of glitching generative AI, and it resonates with Legacy Russell's work on the history of glitch. So I was wondering if, according to you, Caroline, if you're breaking and hacking these systems, and I'm quoting you here, do you think that doing this, you are able to reclaim a sense of agency?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, I love Legacy Russell's work. For those that have not read it, she's the author of Glitch Feminism. And so part of that's also a feminist analysis of what does the error mean? What does it mean to be a glitch in a system or unexpected? in a way that you're not designed to fit into the system. And it draws from also a long history of Black feminist intersectional work. I think the easy answer is like, yes, probably that this is maybe the small way to reclaim agency from these larger systems. As an artist, I make some open source work, but not all of my art is open source. Not all of my design work is open source, but large parts are. I'm a part of the Open Source Designers Steering Committee. I used to work at the Wikimedia Foundation. I'm a Wikimedian. I edit. I firmly believe in open internet and creating things for the commons, but I also believe in consent, that not everything I make needs to, be on Flickr or like the Wikimedia Commons as an image, right? And so there are works of mine that are most likely 100% definitely, right, in things like Lion without my consent. And so I also just think maybe it's a part of a certain technology ethos that I have coming from hacking and creating space for what is a hacker and who gets to intervene in technology, especially in a way where you don't have to write code. I can write code, but I'm not great at it, so I don't identify as like an engineer. So I think for me, this is a way to say that if any technology company is going to create something, I'm always going to look for a way to break it. And so this is my way to do that. And then I guess there's the delicious subversiveness of knowing that these systems have my images. And so I'm going to make something that they didn't expect me to make and they didn't intend me to make.
And at the same time, you raised the question in the work of the ethical ambivalence of using these platforms. Like, so even if it's empowering or able to empower minorities in the digital realm, we're like lucid about the fact that there's still like proprietary platforms that are training on content that hasn't been validated by the producers.
Yeah, and I don't even know if these systems are necessarily empowering per se, but I think it's always important to name the systems we're talking about. So I don't think DALL-E or Midjourney at its heart are perhaps empowering, but I could see other systems being empowering, right? I think that there is a space to imagine, what if we did make an open source, consensual, artist-run large data set to then make generative AI from. I think that would be really transformative and incredibly interesting for a lot of people, right? And I think it would be incredibly interesting also because the artists would have consented to being a part of it, and they also then would be co-authors. And that's, again, one of the things I loved about working at Wikimedia is that anyone can edit. All of us can edit right now. And there's all different types of editing. I'm what's called a wiki gnome, where I like to go and clean up spelling mistakes or make sure there's not a random comma somewhere. And so that act of cleaning is different than me writing an article page, but it's still a necessary form of maintenance. And so I think that that's been removed for us as creators and image makers and folks that want to contribute to large scale projects. OpenAI has also taken that away from us. Not only have they taken images from people, they've taken our ability to contribute if we wanted to contribute.
Yeah, I think it's such a misnomer that they love to describe these systems as democratizing. It's a really common term, I think, across not just visual Gen AI, but lots of AI. And they say it increases accessibility and is democratizing, but to what degree and what form of accessibility do we want? And then especially in terms of the different models, Stable Diffusion, for example, it has a very clear aesthetic. So it's also driving our aesthetic. And also I think, as a historian, I obviously think it's really interesting to think that these models are trained, on past data. So they're trained on the past, but we as the human, as you mentioned in your presentation, this kind of really bringing the present in and bringing the human element of our existence in the present and our view of the future is another way that we can bring agency into our engagement with Gen AI.
And just really quickly, this is also radically democratizing. We're all photographers now. And so I find it very interesting when people are saying well, generative AI can make me a photographer. Doesn't this do that too? You are, but that's also the beauty of image making. We all have pens or paper, or we have access to pencils. So we're all writers and illustrators. It might not be the exact way you imagine it, but that's the beautiful thing I grappled with in art school that every artist grapples with, is what you imagine and then how you make it that's the artistic process.
Yeah, I think the process, right? It's like we need the friction of the process. And I think often, you know, whether it's ChatGPT to produce a text or an image, it depending on how you use it, obviously our framework deals with lots of different ways of using a model. But if you use it in, say, the Jake, you know, poor Jake in our examples, but if you're using it in the Jake way, this really basic way, then there is no process, there is no friction, there is no chance for that involvement.
Yeah, I'll jump in very briefly. What does it mean to make right now? I think you can read this in two ways, right? One is just sort of unpacking the concept, like what do we mean by the concept of maker or making and so on. But the other is about significance, right? Like what sort of significance do we attribute to the process, right? Like to the sort of actual making parts of it rather than the ideation parts of it, right? And so, I mean, you can think about Gen AI as this like massive, like Silicon Valley sponsored intervention on how we value these different aspects of, you know, making things, the sort of coming up with the idea and the executing things sort of business. And sort of we're not really sort of involved, you know, in this sort of value setting exercise. It's sort of like done for us sort of from the outside by sort of, you know, purporting to make things more democratic and sort of, you know, giving agency to the disempowered who can't hold a pencil straight and so on. I mean, this is really a bullshit story, to be honest. Right, and all of this sort of, you know, explicitly very undemocratic in the way that it sort of, you know, extracts resources, including sort of agency-related resources from other people to enable all this, you know, this whole enterprise. So I think, yeah, this is sort of maybe addressing your point about the politics, you know, of agency surrounding Gen AI. Yeah, absolutely.
I think our time is up. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today, for your attention. And I think the discussion will continue, in the room. So yeah, thanks again.
Luxembourg Art Week would like to thank all speakers and partners for their commitment to the 2025 Art Talk program. The next edition will take place from November 20 to November 22, 2026. Join us for a new series of captivating conferences and conversation about art, live at the fair and available for replay afterwards.